Problem deficytu, niedoskonałości, brak poczucia bezpieczeństwa, nieustanny niepokój często prowadzą do zwiększenia intensywności odczuwania pewnych bodźców. Co dzieje się, jeśli te uczucia zamieszkają w myślach osoby wyjątkowo wrażliwej oraz uważnej? W jaki sposób kryzys oddziałuje na artystów oraz sztukę? Czy to właśnie dzieła nawiązujące do tego niepokoju odpowiadają za dokonywanie się pewnych zmian społecznych? Agnieszka Holland w rozmowie ze Stanleyem Billem o jej definicji kryzysu oraz o tym, w jaki sposób poczucie niepokoju wpływa na jej działalność artystyczną.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here with everybody remotely, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Agnieszka Holland to this conversation at the 15th Congress of Polish Student Societies in the UK. We're being asked to talk about the role of crisis in art, and we might also reverse this wording to talk about the role of art and artists in times of crisis. Perhaps as always, the world is beset by multiple crises right now. One of them is on Poland's eastern border in Ukraine, which is under threat of another Russian invasion after the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Agnieszka, one of your most recent films, Mr. Jones, from 2019, deals with the Holodomor, the preventable famine in Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s, in which several million people died. How did you view your role and perhaps your responsibilities as a Polish artist making a film about a Ukrainian crisis, a Ukrainian tragedy, in the light of a very difficult shared history and of Ukraine's more recent crises since 2014?
Probably the contemporary situation of Ukraine, when I was deciding to make this film, played important role. It was after Maidan. It was after the popular outburst of the aspiration of freedom and democracy, which Ukrainian population shown in very vivid and very radical way. And I was sympathizing with them. I went to Kiev. I was talking to many people. After I became the very ardent defender of my colleague filmmaker who was kidnapped and then arrested by Putin and put to jail for 12 or 20 years. So Oleg Sentsov I'm talking about, who, because I think of pressure from many politicians and artists, he'd been released a few years ago, and fortunately he's able to be a filmmaker again. So I was close to Ukraine because of those events, and probably it made me more sensitive to the subject of Ukrainian history. But the history of the famine was known by me. I knew about those events for quite a long time. I was reading a lot in my youth, starting of my youth, the historical books and the statement of the witnesses and the literature also. And I found, I was thinking for several years already, there's something very wrong and unjust that the communist crimes and Stalinian crimes against humanity are practically not recognized by the wider public opinion. And as much as Nazi crimes are pretty well known and became somehow the part of the system of several nations and countries, Holocaust especially, the communist crimes was forgotten and forgiven. And that was one of the reasons why I thought that the story of Holodomor needs to be told for the as wide audience as possible. And we've been believing that this film, the script, gave us the point of view and the chance to make this story relevant and interesting for the people over the world. When going deeper into the research and documentation of those events, I started to feel the responsibility also. Also, I realized that somehow, if the film has some wider public, it becomes I'm becoming the voice of the nation, which is not my nation. But I think my nation is humanity, so I don't feel that it's something inappropriate when I'm doing the movie about the victims of Ukrainian famine or a communist regime in Czechoslovakia or Holocaust in different countries and so on. And also, this film has another interesting for me aspect, which is even more relevant. It is the questions about the role of the media and the governments and the circumstances when the media become corrupted politically and change to some kind of the fake news and propaganda, when the media are very connected to some political agenda, when the public opinion is indifferent to the terrible things which is going on, and the governments and politicians are cowardish and opportunist. When those three factors meet, anything is possible, and the democracy practically doesn't have the space to breathe. And I think that we are very much in similar kind of the situation today. It's a lot of situation which reminds us the 30s of 20th century. So I thought that this film can be some kind of the warning, some kind of the signal to the people that, look, what's going on when we close our eyes and ears.
So that's interesting that essentially a film that you were making about a historical crisis in Ukraine, you made very much in the light of what you understood to be contemporary crises affecting not just Ukraine, but the general communicational fora in which we all operate. In particular, of course, this is the character of Walter Duranty, the American journalist that's represented in your film, who becomes a kind of apologist for the Stalinist regime. But on the other hand, the hero of your story is this Welsh journalist, a graduate of Cambridge University, I might add, the titular Mr. Jones. Now, there's a need in a film like this one that compresses a lot of history into a small space while also telling the story of this individual, sometimes to create a reality that doesn't exactly reflect the truth of events of that individual. And I know that that's something that, for instance, Mr. Gareth Jones's family had some concerns about, things that were inaccurate in the film. It's a common sort of set of complaints or concerns that are raised after most historical films come out. And I wonder if you could say something about how you reconcile that need to be true to the events of particular individuals that are represented, whilst at the same time telling a broader story about the era, or in this case, also telling a story about our own era.
Actually, the most of the Gareth Jones family have been very pleased with the film and supporting it. Probably it was one or two persons who had some problems with some specific situation, where we don't know if it did happen or not. And we, when doing biographical stories, and I did several, I think that I have to follow my intuition and some kind of the imagination, psychological and human imagination, because we never know everything, even with better documented life than Gareth Jones's life, which was not so very well documented, or Jan Mikolaszek, Charlatan, which was my next film, my last film. Life is plenty of things we don't know, and we are unable even to reconstruct factographically. But even if you have the people who are celebrities and under the spot of the light, it's plenty we don't know. We don't know what was going on inside of their souls, how much their, I don't know, diaries or interviews or statement or letters are accurate and how much they are constructing their official image they want to be remembered by the world. The mystery of the human soul and mystery of human's behavior when he is alone and no one sees him, it's impossible to know. So you never know full truth about somebody. You have the dots, and being an artist or being the storyteller, you have to like connect those dots uh, exactly by your imagination and intuition. So I don't feel bad if somebody says me, but he never met this person or he would never do this. I don't know, maybe he didn't, but maybe he did. And if he did, what is important is some like wider and deeper truth, more than the factual truth. At least that is my approach. And I'm doing fictional films. I'm not doing documentaries. And of course, it's different when you are doing documentary. Especially if it's the factual documentary, because the documentary can be also very creative, very imaginary. But when you are doing factual documentary, you have to stick to the facts which have been documented. But I choose, the future film exactly to have the freedom to play freely with humans' destinies and lives. Of course, if you do the travesty, if you do something to hurt this person or the memory of it, that is different. Yes, I think that is, you have some limits, some moral limits when you cannot go over. Over some borders of honesty. But I think everyone has a bit individual this kind of the limits and borders. Mine I pretty high.
I was very interested to hear you say before that in making this film, to some extent, you felt a sense of mission to convey to a wider audience something about Stalinist crimes that might be less known than, for example, the crimes of Nazi Germany. So it sounds almost as if you're viewing this film as a fulfillment. Oh, we have another guest here. Welcome. As a fulfillment.
Sorry.
Maybe he can be introduced. Hello,
His name is Berek.
Berek. Welcome,
Berek.
welcome to the Berek. Welcome. Uh, so it seems almost as if this film is a fulfillment of your earlier films on the Holocaust, so the Europa and In Darkness. But in any case, many of your films, especially in early and the more recent phases, do deal with this traumatic 20th century history of Central and Eastern Europe, depicting the German occupation, the Holocaust, the post-war communist regimes, and with a particular focus on Poland and the former Czechoslovakia. Do you sense a common thread running through your particular approach, your representations of this terrible history of violence and oppression in your region?
Well, I think that it's some genetic memory which I have. It means my family was the perfect example of these experiences of the citizens of Central Europe in 20th century. My father was a Jew. My mother was Polish underground fighter during the Second World War. After they both been communists in post-war communist Poland, where the most of the population was anti-communist. And finally they paid, especially my father paid like very high price for his beliefs and then for his disillusions. And the most of the family of my father, practically entire family except of two or three person, was killed during the Holocaust. They perished. I didn't know for a long time even their names because my father never spoke about his family. He died when he was 41, so I was too young to push to press him, to tell me something about his childhood and so. So it was full of the secrets and mysteries and traumas and bad choices, tragic choices, and the wonderful courage in the same time. And the question, how much our identity depends on us and how much we are some kind of the toys in the hands of the history, in the hands of the regimes. That is the question which I think is very relevant in Central and Eastern Europe. And in the same time, it's some kind of the laboratory for the humanity, I think. This experience, especially communist and Nazi experience, the experience of those two totalitarisms, in my opinion, was never consumed, was never like reworked. It was like the vaccination against the nationalism and the wars in Europe, and it helped to create the, I think, extremely revolutionary institution, which is European Union. But this vaccination, as any vaccination, in some point is losing its efficiency. And I started to feel it even in 80s. I started of 20th century. I started to feel that if we'll not give the booster, the people will lose the immunity, and that the things like Holocaust and Auschwitz can come back again. And I think we are now facing this situation when anything is possible again.
Does history? It's interesting what you say about this laboratory almost of the two totalitarian regimes that this region of Europe was forced through. And I think it's true that much of the innovation and then the influence outside of the region of artists from Poland and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe partly comes from this searching for forms of expression that would somehow be capable of capturing these very extreme experiences. But I wonder whether history ever also becomes a burden to a Polish artist. For many post-war filmmakers and writers, there's almost a sense of moral obligation to bear witness or to memorialize the suffering of the dead, a working through of the collective traumas of a country that was almost destroyed. Some artists have found this need constraining. So I was looking back before our discussion at a poem by Czesław Miłosz, written in the ruins of Warsaw in 1945, in which he refers to dead hands that seize his pen and order him to write the stories of their lives and deaths, seeming to force him almost against his will as an artist to become what he calls a ritual mourner. And there's a very long tradition of engaged, politicized art in the name of the oppressed in Polish culture, reaching back at least as far as the Romantics. Do you ever feel any of Miłosz's ambivalence about the burden of history? Or do you rather see artistic opportunities in this sense of moral obligation to the dead?
I think it's both. Because sometimes it can be a burden, and especially the burden if this discussion is claustrophobic. If this, I try to translate this experience to the more universal experience. That it was the talent of Andrzej Wajda, who was my friend and mentor and producer in on the beginning of my filmmaking career. And he was the most Polish and somehow maybe even you can tell romantic filmmaker in the history of the cinema. But in the same time, his films have been relevant and understandable for the wider audience. And he had, even without speaking any language except of Polish, a bit Russian and a bit Serbian, he was able to translate this very Polish experience to the universal language. And I think when you are translating into the universal language, you don't have this suffocating feeling that you are condemned to be close in those, complexes and traumas and stresses and frustrations. You try to make out of this experience something which can be, I don't want to say useful because it's like maybe too practical expression, but inspiring, or which can create the experience for other people to live through and feel what we are feeling. And also, but of course, it is also the conversation among Poles, between Poles and Poles. And now, when the polarization in the country is tragically high and practically makes impossible any kind of the dialogue between two bubbles, two halves of the society, um, this um, this. This conversation, this fight for the soul of Poles, it takes very radical and dramatic dimension. It's not that I feel happy to be one of those of those sides, but in the same time, I find it interesting, and everything is interesting in the world now. The world is in terrible, crisis, and the democracy is in terrible crisis. We have plenty of the challenges and dangers which humanity doesn't know how to deal with, and uh, we don't even know if some apocalyptic vision will not become real. But in the same time, this time of the change and of the huge change is very interesting to watch and to express. It's why I'm a bit bored and irritated when the cinema is going over his own curve. How do you say? What dog has this thing?
Chasing its own tail.
Tail,
Its own
right?
tail, yes.
Mhm. So I think that we need, the world is so interesting and so challenging and so new. Even if repeating some old agendas or patterns, that that I think that the cinema still can be, or audiovisual storytelling wider, can be the great tool to open the new windows and to see better and brighter.
Of course, your filmmaking career is very diverse and varied in the output that you've produced. And many of your films are not political at all. And many of your films have nothing to do with Poland and its region. And indeed, much of your career, probably most of it, has been devoted to international productions, frequently working with American producers and actors, among others. Films that I particularly like include The Secret Garden from 1993 and The Third Miracle from 1999. They're films that are dealing with very different kinds of crises, with sort of spiritual, individual crises, or crises of faith, in the case of The Third Miracle. In these films and others, you seem also to achieve an interesting mix of a kind of Polish aesthetic, whatever that means, and feel free to challenge that, grounded not just in your own approach, but also in your consistent choice of great Polish cinematographers and composers with American or British production values and acting styles. I think it's a really interesting combination. Have you felt at all that this hybrid cinema, maybe we can call it a kind of Polish cosmopolitan cinema, is something that you have consciously created, or how do you choose your very diverse international projects?
Well, I'm not the film critic of myself, so it's difficult. It's very interesting what we are telling, and I really enjoy listening to that. The Polish cosmopolitan hybrid. I think it's really very interesting. I will think about it. But everything is much more spontaneous and a bit hazardous. I'm choosing my subjects because in this very moment the story speaks to me, and I have the desire and sometimes the urge even to tell the story and to express what is in the story, and to translate it to the audiovisual language. It's rarely deliberated and planned. It's making the films, and I did many films and TV series. It's like going from one station to another, and when you come to the station, you don't know what will be the next stop. You see different possible roads, and you are taking one which seems to be the most interesting and appropriate. Uh, And why I do my films myself, in terms that I'm always somehow, I think, sincere, not only to my aesthetics, but also to my need of expression. So it is Polish, of course, but in the same time, uh, I think that I'm probably less Polish than most of my colleagues, and it's why it was possible for me to work in different countries and different languages. Sometimes even in the languages I don't speak at all, like German, and still stay myself. And when I have the opportunity to work with my friends, Polish talented artists, cinematographers, or composers, exactly, or sometimes production designers as well, I feel better, because I'm like in the family, and we have the shortcuts when communicating. I don't need to learn them from the beginning every time. We know each other. And we have the similar kind of the education, and similar kind of the cultural references. But also, I was watching, when I was reading the books, and I was reading a lot of books when I was a child or a young person. I was not reading only Polish literature. I was reading all literature which was possible accessible in translations, Russian, British, American, French, a lot of Italian, and so. Same with the movies. So I don't feel that my heritage is particular, only Polish art. It's when I decided to make a Secret Garden, it was because this book was for me extremely important when I was a child, and it's like many children books, the best children books, which has very strong emotional symbolism. I think it was formative book for me as a young girl, or a little girl even. So it was my gift, to the next generation, but also it was some kind of the meeting with myself when I was a child. Um, and working in the world, exactly, it has some limitations, because you have to simplify your language a bit to become a little more generic. Uh, but in the same time, it widens your scope. It widens the space. It is every time the new experience.
I loved hearing what you said about The Secret Garden. It was also one of my favorite books as a child in Australia. I still remember reading it in one night. I couldn't put it down. And when I came across your film, I was enchanted by your vision of it. And then with your particular aesthetic and the music of Zbigniew Preissner, this very Polish composer that just fit the vision that I had of the book and yet took it somewhere else at the same time. Now, you've worked quite a lot on television as well, including on critically acclaimed American series that have been part of the great transformation of television to a high art form, in inverted commas. In particular, David Simon's classics, The Wire and Treme as well. Can you talk about how you see the differences in genre and in your own work as a director between feature films and television series?
It is. I'm. The real master and the modern television is the writer, is creator and the writer, and mostly creator writer is also the showrunner. So the director has much more serving role than in the future cinema, when I'm or miniseries, which mostly has only one director, one author. Uh, and you have to be more humble. You are serving somebody's vision more than realizing yourself, especially if it's an episodic television and you are not formatting it. With David Simon, it was extremely interesting meeting, because he's extremely interesting person, writer, and human being and citizen. And it was for me great lesson of America. It means I'm really grateful for that, because I know that because I worked on The Wire. I started in the third season, and after I did the episode in every next season. But with Treme, David asked me to make the pilot and to format this this series, which was very unusual because it's very American series about very American story, very American city, New Orleans, which is very specific and has very specific cultural roots and has very specific tragic history and contemporary dramas. So invite Polish women to do this very American, very New Orleans series. It was surprising. Uh, but I think that in some moment this hybrid happened, and my experiences, for example, of my childhood in ruined Warsaw, in the Warsaw after the Second World War, when I was born in the middle of the ruins, and this trauma of a destroyed city after Katrina somehow melted together, and I understood, I think maybe better than a lot of American filmmakers, what kind of the tragedy and what kind of the trauma exactly they are going through. So I had great connection with the local people and with the Black community as well, musical community, but also the different activists and people. And I learned a lot about America when doing Tremé, but also The Wire. The Wire is considered as one of the greatest series, not the greatest one. And it is like great American novel. It is like it has this epical scope which speaks about American tragedy much more than a lot of literature, and certainly no movie in our days. So I feel honored that I was able to take part in this experience and experience it myself. But from the directorial artistic point of view, as I say, I'm not the owner of this story. I'm just the humble servant.
Was it very difficult for you to come into a show like The Wire, which was already in its third season by the time you got there, and to begin working with a team of people who presumably knew each other quite well, and you come in as this director from another country whose experience seems very different from that of the Baltimore being represented in this series? Was that something that was, even for somebody with all of your experience, was it still an intimidating experience on some level?
No, I was afraid only if I will be able, because I didn't do television, American television before, and the shooting time you have to shoot one episode was quite short in this time. So to be sure, I agreed to do another much more commercial series before, Cold Cases, to check if I'm able, to deliver in 7 days of shooting. But when I came to The Wire, I knew a few people. I knew several people. I knew pretty well the crew because it was third work I did in Baltimore. I shot Washington Square in Baltimore, and I shot the movie, HBO movie called Shot in the Heart in Baltimore. And on this movie, I was working with producer Nina Noble, who is David Simon's producer. And she invited me, actually. She convinced David that it would be interesting to have me on the board. And so I didn't, and she gave me like supplementary day. And every season, actually, I came back, I had 1 day more than the other directors. So I felt privileged from this point of view. And I had a lot of friends among crew. So it was every time when I was coming to Baltimore, it was like coming home or to the place I know I studied or something. And it didn't end with The Wire, because after House of Cards, when I did 4 episodes, also was shooting in Baltimore with the many members of my crew of previous work. Was on this show as well. So Baltimore is actually the city, in American city, I spent a lot of time in. I'm Baltimorean somehow.
Let me also take the opportunity just to remind the viewers, the participants in the Congress, to send through their questions. I believe some will be coming through. I don't see any at the moment, but I'll be looking out for those so that we can get some questions from the audience. Just to move back to Poland now, Poland's cultural institutions in general have recently been under some pressure from the current peace-led government, which has sought to install people friendly to its ideological agenda in key positions. Has this process affected filmmaking in the country? And how do you generally see the health of contemporary Polish cinema?
Well, I think that unfortunately it did. It means not so much fictional cinema, not so much future films so far. So far, I think that it didn't influence so much the subjects or content or the vision of the directors. Uh, but I'm afraid it's changing right now because the radicalization of this right wing government is growing, and some authoritarian ambitions and desires are coming on the surface in very visible way. About documentaries, that is visible for several years already, that the documentaries made in Poland are auto-censor or they are censors. Some recent examples of that, which I'm not sure if I can mention because I'm not sure if the producers would like to make it public. But yeah, we feel all that this pressure of the cultural authorities are growing, and the theaters and the galleries and the institutions, cultural institutions, are suffering from the censor in a very strong way. I just hope that it will end, because the path it's really going down. It is worse and worse, and if you will put the pandemic on the top, and the fact that the culture creative sector have been damaged by the pandemics very much, and a lot of exhibitions and theaters and the cinema distribution and musical events. It practically didn't exist for quite a long time, or it changed the habits also of the people, and the artists and people working in the creative sector are very poor now. They don't have the resources. They are very easy to break. And a lot of things can happen only when we try to make some kind of the crowdfunding. But when the people are crowdfunding everything, you cannot finance anything, And so yeah, it is not the good situation. But on another hand, I think that it's stimulating situation. You have to be really strong to survive, and I think to build up the strength and to be pressed to make the choices, the real choices, and to decide if you want to stand for something you believe in and or not. That is some kind of the test of human strength, and sometimes even of humanity.
I want to ask a follow-up question, but first I'm asked by the organizers to let the audience know that they can ask questions, or to remind them that they can ask questions through the Slido mobile app, and that the entrance code is 746401. If there are any questions for Benek, I can hear he's there in the background as well. So that's a reminder about questions. But just to come back to contemporary Polish cinema, are there particular filmmakers or films that have been made recently in Poland that particularly interest you, or developments in contemporary Polish cinema that you're watching with special interest?
I think that the Polish cinema has quite high level in the last, let's say, 10 years. And it's very versatile. It's a lot of the filmmakers of the younger generation, the middle generation, and some older are still active, as myself. It's more and more women filmmakers, and they are all, I think, quite interesting, or very interesting. And of course, you have the well-known directors like Paweł Pawlikowski, who is a British-Polish filmmaker, but he chose, in last 10 years, he chose Poland, and his most famous and most acclaimed work came from Poland, Ida or Cold War. They are very, worldwide known films, and he got a first Polish Oscar actually. But also younger filmmakers. Every year you have 2-3 films which I think have international acclaim. And what was great before pandemic, that a lot of films have been also very popular with Polish audience. And I'm not speaking only about romantic comedies or the comedies of or I don't know, some kind of detective stories, but I'm speaking about quite complex and complicated cinema, which sometimes is touching the social issue and asking important questions about Polish contemporary life and Polish history. And in the same time, some of them are really universal. Like as example, from 2 years old, I can quote Communion, Corpus Christi, Jan Komasa's film, which been nominated for an Oscar as well, and had very, very wide distribution over Europe. And I think, and it has very, very good box office, very high box office in Poland as well. With my films, it's mixed in Poland, but some of them have been also quite popular. And my second Holocaust drama, third after Europa and Angry Harvest, In Darkness, had over 1,200,000 viewers in Poland, in the cinemas only, and much more, of course, on other medias. So we can prove that we have the connection with the audience and younger audience. And now we are waiting the moment when when the effects of the pandemic will disappear, and that they will disappear. And I just hope that the habits will not change too much, and the young people will come back to the theaters.
We do have some questions now from the audience. So we have one question, which is, what advice would you give about pursuing a career in screenwriting?
Well, first you have to have something to tell, and you have to be quite courageous and original and curious when doing that. Because if you have important stories to tell, and if you have important experiences to share, you have to learn, of course, some rules of the screenwriting, because it's pretty stiff structure. The theatrical cinema, it is about 2 hours time, so you have to squeeze your story into this format. And when you are writing for the television, the TV series has something a bit conventional. Every episode has to have some kind of the structure to end in the way that you will want to see the next episode, which after a while becomes a bit boring to me. So it's why I'm not so attracted anymore in doing TV series. But you have to learn those rules. You have the schools, and you have, of course, the workshops. You have plenty of books written by more or less successful screenwriter, how to write the good script. I will not read too much of that. You can also read Aristotle's Poetic, because it's exactly the same rules which are in this ancient Greek book, which applies to today, at least European and American storytelling, and the nature of our perception of the drama. But the main thing, it is to have something interesting to say.
Thank you. I'm sure that response will be greatly appreciated. So more questions from the audience at the 15th Congress of Polish Student Societies. Which book or film speaks most to you?
It's not one. I cannot quote like one book or one film. Some books I'm coming back to. Of course, I was the most receptive when I was young. So my favorite cinema is cinema of 60s and 70s of 20th century. And I think it was the most innovative period in the history of the cinema so far. and it was a lot of extremely talented filmmakers and very original filmmakers, and it was dozens of them in many countries. And I think personally that they've been so interesting and so brave, artistically speaking, because the audience was also much more curious about the new languages, and it was because those generations went through the experience of the Second War, and they felt that they have to to go further, to try more, to this experience made them more interesting people and more interesting artists. Uh, so I'm coming back to the movies of this period quite often, to tell classics today. And also the books I was reading when I was young, the classics like of 20th century especially, but also of 19th century, the great novels like by Dostoevsky or Stendhal or Tolstoy or Chekhov, and Kafka, who I plan to make the movie about now. Also, and several writers of 20th
That's a very
century.
intriguing. That's a very intriguing hint that you've just given us. A film about Kafka. Is that something you're
Well, we
working
are
on now, or it's coming in the?
that it will be probably for next year, not before. But we started to work with the screenwriter, Czech screenwriter, who we've been collaborating with on Charlatan, to try to make this not the like classical biopic of Kafka, but to try to to analyze the mystery of and the different layers of his existence and of the impact he did, and also of the kitsch which was built around of him. So yeah, something a little less conventional. We try to make that the regular biopic, but also I have in plans the film, another biographical films about Orwell, about the last period
Mhm.
in Orwell's life, which maybe we will do also by the end of this year or next year. So I have like several plans like that, but coming. I told to myself in some point that I will be not doing any more biographical stories, but I'm lucky enough to receive the scripts which are treating those biographical stories in very unconventional way. So suddenly it becomes very like inspiring and interesting, and it's like searching for the mystery, for discovering the mystery of another very interesting human being. And of course, you never can see this mystery fully.
Well, we'll be looking forward to both of those films. Another question here: do you think cinema will die? And indeed, I mean, the pandemic has affected the way in which people watch films. Of course, fewer people are going to the cinema to see films on the big screen in a dark room with other people, and more are choosing streaming services and watching films on a little laptop screen at home. Now, whether cinema or not will die, is it changing the way in which films are made? Or what are your hopes and expectations for the future?
Well, the film Alma is pretty much in the same way. Maybe you have a little less of production value when you are doing it for smaller medium, but with the quality of the new techniques, even this it's not relevant. And but yeah, I hope it will not die, because it is completely different experience to see the movie in the dark room on the big screen, and as a collective experience, and to see it lonely in some kind of the small room on the small device, and it is a difference like between the information and experience. You have all information about the film when you are watching it in this way, but in the same time you not fully experience that. So the sensual impact of the movie or series even it's very, very different. I had the example recently. I was watching some documentary, like very political documentary, Polish documentary, which was made by some courageous people, and they sent me the link to this documentary a few months ago, and I was watching it on my computer, and the premiere of this documentary, small premiere, happened a few days ago on the big screen in the new cinema in Warsaw, which is called Kinogram, and has extremely good quality of the projection. And suddenly, I like this documentary. It was I had a lot of respect for the people who decided to do it, and for the object of this documentary is a documentary about the courageous judges in Poland. But it didn't touch me so much. And when I watched it on the big screen, suddenly I was moved to tears. I was so taken by that. So even something like the documentary, which is not the most visual and the most sensual form of the film storytelling, is totally different in reception when you are watching it in those two different ways. So it will be really a pity if it will just dry this desire to go out and to see it in the theaters. But I hope that that it will come back, except if the new generation change some kind of the mutants and they will cut out any kind of the human connections. So
There is, as you say, also the dimension of the collective social experience, being in a dark room with other human bodies, other human beings, and the responses that interact with your own responses around you. There's something that completely changes the experience of watching a film in that way than sitting on your couch at home. Another question, and this is one that you're probably well placed to answer, is about suggesting that Polish cinema is not getting as much international recognition as, for example, French or Italian. And the question is how it can be made more accessible to international audiences. So as you've said before, you're a Polish filmmaker that made the leap to the international scene quite early and successfully, and have really stayed there. What kind of advice would you give young Polish filmmakers, for instance, on making their films accessible and appealing to international audiences? Or is that even something that they should be focusing on specifically?
No, I think they have to make good movies, and when they are doing good movies, and in the same time, don't forget that those movies has to be understandable not only to Polish but also to the wider audience. They can succeed. I think that the successes of Polish cinema in several periods of the history of cinema have been much bigger than the size of the country, especially the size of the production. When the French are doing about 300 movies by year, and Poles are doing like really films, not some kind of low budget simple stories. It's about 40, 50. So and they are mostly under budgeted because it's not a lot of possible money for the cinema in the country like Poland, where the private sector is not financing cinema, and the public funds are of course limited, and now they are even somehow not objectively given to everybody. So I don't feel frustrated. I was the chairwoman of the European Film Academy for several years, and now I'm president of this institution. And we are watching every year a lot of European best films. It means the films which been recognized somehow, and have to decide about the selection of 50, which after are given to the members of the academy to vote for the nomination, and then the best movies or best actresses and so on. And when we are choosing, we try to cover a bit, the diversity of Europe, but we have most of the years we have the embarras de richesse with Polish movies. It's mostly 5 or 6 which we would like to have among 50. Of course, after we limit it to 2, 3 mostly. But it proves that it's one of the most solid, at least was before COVID, solid cinematography of Europe. Uh, and also having the one of the most faithful audience for the domestic production. So I don't feel that we are in crisis. It means we are maybe now because of the circumstances, but if everything is going in natural way, the Polish cinema it's quite muscular.
I have a question that is asking about new media platforms such as YouTube or TikTok. Do you see potential for art to develop on those platforms? And perhaps do you have any interest in those platforms yourself?
Well, TikTok, I don't know at all. I think it's for very young people and it's Chinese, so I'm trying to avoid it. At YouTube, I'm just mostly watching the content on YouTube. I know that it's possible some production with YouTube, and it can be very successful. I think that any kind of the platforms give the possibility to extend and to versify the production. So I'm not against any kind of the platforms. I think that more of platforms we have, better for the for the creativity and the production. But telling that, I am a bit afraid of the enormous quantity of the content which is not curated and which makes the choice of the most interesting original things quite difficult for the audience. So and the situation and the authority of film critics, it's shrinking. So we have very few really competent curators to put the light and attention on the quality of the production. So that is my main concern.
And just on TikTok, you're suspicious of it because of its association potentially with the authoritarian Chinese government. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, but I heard about some. I don't know if it's true. I heard about some manipulation there. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Yeah.
I think social medias are that is exciting and very dangerous. So sorry for Berek.
That's okay. Benek.
Głodny. Mhm. He's hungry probably. Hello? I don't hear you.
If we come back to the question of crisis, almost 6 million people have died worldwide over the last 2 years in the coronavirus pandemic. It's over 150,000 in the UK and over 100,000 in Poland. That means that many individuals and families have experienced their own private tragedies in this time. But the collective processing of these enormous losses remains somehow unclear. The pandemic clearly disrupted film production, as we've already said, but can the pandemic also be in itself a compelling subject for cinema or other art forms? Do you know of any interesting recent productions? How can the experiences of the last 2 years, which somehow seem not very cinematic, but how can they find artistic expression?
I don't know. I think that probably nothing really interesting will not come out of that. It is. I think that the people don't want to watch it because they felt too fearful on the beginning of that, and after they feel too tired and frustrated, and it is something which doesn't depend on them really. So it is when you think about the books or films about pandemics before, it was very few examples in the history which really made the impact. The Pest by Albert Camus in the first place, the Magic Mountain, somehow it is not exactly the pandemic, but it's a sickness. And the Spain flu, which decimated Europe, which made more victims than the First World War, practically disappeared from the collective memory. No one for decades was talking, for 100 years was talking about the Spain flu. And it was even more traumatic experience that the pandemic, that the coronavirus now. So I think that the people want very quickly to forget this experience, and so I don't think that it will turn. Maybe somebody will be genius enough to capture the biggest change is the change in notion of the freedom. And we see this like stupid battle between the people who think that it is impossible to impose the sanitary rules and the vaccination because it touches their freedom, and others who in too humble way accept the most even stupid or unnecessary restrictions of the freedom. And we see that this individual freedom versus collective freedom is the very relevant questions right now, and we have to treat it in totally new way to really capture what is the essence of that.
So, in other words, the pandemic reveals or exacerbates some deeper crises that are and should be the subject for cinema. But the pandemic in itself, in some way, that illness is not a cinematic subject in the same way as
When
mass
it's
killing
real,
in
when
war, for instance.
it can be if it's imaginary, like for example,
Yeah.
Soderbergh's film Contagion, which was made many years before this pandemic, was very exciting. But the film made after with the similar kind of the story, I think that will be not attractive to the audience. I think it doesn't mean that it cannot be something good, and that you have to forget about it. I'm just speaking about what will be the reception probably, and how difficult it is to find the way to speak about it and in the same time be accessible and attractive to the people.
It seems that in general, our societies are having a difficult time processing the loss or even representing the loss. And it seems to be the case that might be in art too. Agnieszka Holland, thank you very much for this conversation today, for sharing all of these insights, for answering our questions. And we wish you all the very best with your ongoing film projects. And we look forward to the films that you've kindly hinted at that will be coming in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley, and thank you everybody who was watching us, and all the best, good future and the end of the pandemic, I wish to everybody. And go back to the theaters, go back to the cinema, to the exhibition galleries, to the concerts, just consume the culture, really, live.